Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the四海为学collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you to our 14th book discussion and our 54th event. Today, we are going to discuss Professor Karen Thornber's Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian Literature. We have Professor Durba Mitra, Professor Bruce Fulton, and Professor Faye Xiao to discuss with us here today. I think this is a fantastic topic. We were already talking about it before the event, so I'm sure that we're going to have a really great time this morning, this evening, or whatever. Our chair today is Abigail Wang. She's also from East China Normal University. It has become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience today who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event today will be 2 hours, and we will end promptly at 10 a.m. Beijing time, which is just about 2 hours from now. And before getting things started and handing them over to Abigail, I just want to say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive, somewhat conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks and jerks or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wang, is a play on 四海为家. So this is the idea that everyone's part of a giant family, basically. And we hope to keep this as a sort of guiding idea for all of our events. So the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to do this and accomplish some sort of shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people can truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors Karen, Durba, Bruce, and Faye for being with us here today. Our chair is Abigail Wang. She is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Philosophy at East China Normal University. Her research focuses on modern reconstructions of early Chinese thought, with a particular interest in how Taoist philosophy was reframed by Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century. She applies discourse analysis and microhistorical methods to explore the transformation of classical traditions into modern academic disciplines. Her work has appeared in journals such as Contemporary Chinese Thought, Asian Studies, Tao, and Philosophy East and West. So, happy to see you online, Abigail. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Karen Thornber, the author of Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian Literatures, the book at the heart of today's discussion. Professor Thornber is the Harry Tuckman Levin Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, and also serves as the Richard L. Menschels Faculty Director of the Derek Bok Center for Teaching and Learning. Her scholarship spans East Asian cultural history and the medical environmental humanities. She's the author of the 4 major monographs, including Empire of Text in Motion, Eco-Ambiguity, and Global Healing. Her most recent work, the one we'll be discussing today, offers a timely and far-reaching engagement with gender justice across Asian literary landscape. Professor Thornber, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you, Paul, for setting this all up. I do have some slides to share, so let me get that going here. Okay. Yeah. There we go. Okay. You're all seeing the screen, I hope? Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, so it's my pleasure to be here today to speak with you all about my new book, Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian Literatures. I put in the phrase Asian diaspora literatures because, of course, the book discusses Asian diaspora literatures as well. Before getting started, though, I just want to thank Paul D'Ambrosio and his colleagues at East China Normal University for making this all possible. To our panelists, my colleagues, Durba, Bruce, and Faye, to our audience who's with us either a little bit later in the evening or early in the morning, as well as to my student research assistants who really helped me a lot with this book during COVID. This was definitely a COVID era project, and I would not have been able to do it without my students. As Abigail mentioned, this book comes after several other books that I've written, very different books, books on post-colonial East Asia, Empire of Text in Motion, Chinese, Korean, and Taiwanese transculturations of Japanese literature, a book on the environmental humanities and East Asian literature, Eco-Ambiguity, Environmental Crises and East Asian Literatures, and then a book on medical humanities, Global Healing, Literature, Advocacy, Care, that pulled in examples from many parts of the world. Of course, nothing is truly global, but I aimed for more global perspective in that book. And right now I'm writing 2 books, they're both already under contract. One is on intersections of climate change and mental health, and the other is on futures of literary criticism. So you can see my intellectual interests span a great number of fields, but this project, Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian Literatures, is particularly close to my heart, and I'm particularly pleased with what I was able to do in this book, while acknowledging that there is, or recognizing there is so much more work in this field that needs to be done. So in brief, Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian and Asian Diaspora Literatures analyzes how diverse writers across East, South, and Southeast Asia, as well as Asia's diasporas, have engaged over the past 50 years with struggles for and denials of gender justice amid pandemics of gender inequity and gender-based violence. I begin the introduction to this book with a really powerful short story by the Indian writer Urmila Pawar, short story titled Justice from 1988. And in brief, this story is about a rural widow, Harubapa Surve, who is pregnant and who is called before a tribunal of men in her rural village who are determined that she meet justice because as a widow who's pregnant, she's had sex outside of marriage, and this they cannot tolerate. But she stands up to these individuals and she says, "All you people listen and give me justice. I was going to the city with a big heavy basket full of bananas on my head to sell, when all of a sudden someone came up from behind and pounced on me. When I came to, I realized that sexual violence had been committed against me." This doesn't move the tribunal, but Paru continues to push back, and she rebuts an elderly villager's claim that on no account can we let that bastard child live. Now, the narrator of this story is an absentee landlord who's really impressed with Paru's pushing back. And he says, everyone was united in seeing so-called justice carried out against her. But Paru had taken justice into her own hands. So what happens in this short story, and again, it's a very short story, is that justice is reconfigured. The punishment that was called justice, that Paru describes in a 1998 interview as having inspired her short story, becomes a different kind of justice, a rejection of punishment. At the same time, however, the reshaping of justice that takes place in this short story justice is only very partial. It doesn't demand accountability, and even more important, it doesn't address other systemic gender inequities, much less the gender-based violence that Paru is likely to continue to face given the absence of structural changes that would reduce her vulnerability. And what I mean by this is that she remains an impoverished farmer, a widow, who will continue to travel alone to sell her produce in a society with little deterrence for rape. And so I started the book with this short story because it illustrates so much of what I try to address in the book. I talk in the introduction, though, on why I've decided to focus on gender justice and particularly justice vis-a-vis women. Put simply or succinctly, women are the largest group treated inequitably because of their gender. It's estimated that a third of women globally have experienced physical and/or sexual violence. So you do the math on this, this is more than 1 billion people. Of course, still greater numbers of women are subjected to economic, emotional, mental, and other forms of bias, mistreatment, and abuse purely on account of their gender. Anita Hill has called this an ongoing catastrophe. She's speaking of the situation in the United States, but what she describes is also much more broadly applicable. But why look at literature? Why look at literature as a window into providing us much needed information and inspiration on gender justice? Well, justice is often discussed in the abstract or as a matter of law, political history, protest movements, enfranchisement, and similar phenomena. And all this is super important. Right? We need to talk about justice in these ways. At the same time, however, justice also involves individuals and their experiences that in many cases are most directly accessed through stories. Some of the things that literature and stories more broadly can do are create different worlds where survivors and victims alike retain dignity and make and remake traditions, places where perpetrators are held accountable and systems are transformed. Of course, literatures from around the world have for centuries reinforced heteronormative gender expectations and gender hierarchies. Literatures, stories more broadly have propagated prejudices and stigmas. They've justified brutality. So I don't want to claim or have any of us think that, well, literature will solve all our problems. That's not true. Right? But even as many writers throughout history have reinforced heteronormative gender expectations, many other writers have challenged aesthetic and social expectations. Many writers have relentlessly broken silences. They've demanded accountability, and they've called explicitly or implicitly for justice. Literature, stories more broadly, tend to highlight individual voices and experiences. And many of these individual voices and experiences have long been disregarded. At the same time, though, that literature highlights individual voices and experiences, it also can expose ubiquity and ferocity of gender inequity and gender-based violence. The stories literature tells have long revealed the devastating short-term and long-term physical, psychological, social, and economic impacts of gender injustice on individuals, on families, and on communities. Stories vividly depict the intensity of personal suffering, at the same time that they can create counter-narratives, at the same time that they humanize those facing injustice, those fighting for justice, spotlighting dignity and agency amid broader familial, economic, social, cultural, and historical dynamics. So a lot of humanizing that takes place in this writing. It's not just about suffering, although that is hugely important as well. In addition, narratives help readers put their own experiences and traumas into broader perspective. And I think this was one of the most moving things to me as someone who's taught this material in different contexts at Harvard, both at the college and in the summer school, is that teaching stories on gender inequity and gender-based violence has impressed on me their broad affective and emotional impact on readers, particularly younger students, early year college students who've had really terrible things happen to them, or they've heard this happened to friends or family members, and they thought they were alone. Then they read stories where similar things happen, similar dynamics are at play, and they don't feel as alone anymore, and this makes a big difference on them. At the same time, as Viet Thanh Nguyen has passionately argued, literature does not change the world until people get out of their chairs, go out into the world, and do something to transform the conditions of which literature speaks. So literature can provide us with knowledge, with information, with insight. It also can provide us with that inspiration to go out and help change things. Why the focus on Asia and Asian diasporas? Well, of course, I'm a scholar of Asia, so that's a natural segue. But also here, I think this is equally important, East, South, and Southeast Asia, as well as their diasporas within Asia and around the world, together make up about 60% of global population. Asia is also an extraordinarily diverse place, economically, historically, culturally, linguistically, and in many, many other ways. At the same time, the overall severity and impact of gender-based violence in Asia, as in many parts of the world, is irrefutable. The World Economic Forum's annual Global Gender Gap Report estimates that at the current pace, it'll take most of Asia anywhere from 149 years to nearly 2 centuries to close its gender gaps. Now, I want to have a big caveat here that the Global Gender Gap Report can be very misleading in parts, and I talk in the introduction to my book of how we can't just rely on this or any other single report or any single set of statistics, because statistics can be misleading, unintentionally so. But the Statistics Global Gender Gap Report provides are important reference points to help us along. I will also say here that Asia is by no means alone in struggling with gender injustice, right? Most parts of the world have similar struggles. Asian and Asian diaspora literatures, not surprisingly, regularly speak to the multiple and diverse forms of gender inequity and gender-based violence experienced by women and gender and sexual minorities from before birth until after death. This is true whether we're looking at East Asian, South Asian, or Southeast Asian literatures. Yet scholarship on literature and gender-based violence remains largely concentrated on narratives from the United States, from Western Europe, and from Canada. This was one of the things that really surprised me when I started doing work on this project. Also noteworthy is that the vast body of non-literary scholarship on gender inequity and gender-based violence, on feminisms, on women in Asia and diasporas tends to center either on a particular region or much more frequently a particular nation. And as noted here, there is a vast body of scholarship on gender inequity and gender-based violence in Asia, and I benefited tremendously from that body of scholarship. What I tried to do, though, in gender justice is look more broadly at Asia, Asians diasporas, through Asian and Asian diaspora literature. A brief word on methodology. Of course, no single methodological approach or theoretical formulation could possibly accommodate the complexities of gender justice and contemporary Asian and Asian diaspora literatures. The phenomena that I discuss are super complex, and I think it's really important to understand gender inequity and gender-based violence from a range of perspectives. So what I tried to do is draw from as many different types of sources as I could. Of course, the creative writing and film, but also memoirs and journalistic nonfiction, media reports, new media, publications by NGOs and other organizations, as well as academic scholarship in a range of fields, from anthropology and gender studies, history, law, literature studies, medicine, philosophy, psychology, public health, sociology, and other fields, to really try to paint or do justice to this really complex picture that I was addressing. In the book itself, I analyze and place in broader context 28 narratives from 13 East, South, and Southeast Asian nations and their diasporas that focus on major forms of gender inequity and gender-based violence. So those are the primary texts that I look at in this book, but I also try to introduce a number of other creative sources from the same communities or from other parts of Asia and diasporas in the hopes of inspiring continued exploration and translation. You know, as with any project, one has to make really difficult choices into, you know, what books one's really going to focus on. And those were difficult choices. And so, as mentioned, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So I'll spend my remaining minutes here in this opening introduction to the book, just going briefly through the chapters. So after the introduction, where I describe methodologies, I describe, you know, why Asia, why literature, and so forth, I have a chapter on social norms, confronting tyrannies of social norms within and beyond families, looking at 3 novels, one each from South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And this chapter looks into how conventional social norms regarding family relentlessly impinge on health and well-being. I explore in this chapter how these 3 novels in particular advocate for increasing gender justice by expanding, if not scrapping entirely, conceptions of what's appropriate and normal. In chapter 2, Struggling for Equity in Male-Dominated Professions, I take on works from Pakistan, Japan, and Singapore. These are 3 very different narratives, but they each highlight not only the tremendous courage of women breaking into and through male-dominated professions. The professions I look at are journalism, finance, and medicine. But these texts also highlight the significant role the virtual strangers can play in ameliorating seemingly insurmountable barriers, as well as the vulnerability of even some of the most gifted, dedicated, and productive women in some of these industries. In the 3rd chapter, I look at a series of short stories, as well as a novel, that focus on women in much less visible, yet even more arduous professions. These are primarily female-dominated professions, reproductive labor that's poorly compensated and most frequently performed by women. And these short stories address sex work, elder care, and domestic work. And they also, as the title suggests, look at works that deal with reproductive work in the context of migration, whether we're talking internal migration, in these cases from rural to urban areas, or whether we're talking transnational migration to different parts of Asia, from less wealthy to wealthier parts of Asia. Beginning with the 4th chapter, so the 4th through the 7th chapter, I talk about narratives that address explicitly or engage quite deeply with different forms of gender-based violence. First of these is Chapter 4, Capitulating to and Fighting Against Reproductive Violence, looking at a film and a novel by members of the Chinese diaspora, a novel by an Indian woman, and a novel by a Japanese woman. And these texts and narratives all deal with reproductive violence that's been endorsed, if not mandated, by governments. And these narratives look at diverse aspects of struggles for reproductive justice in Asia and far beyond. And they take up issues such as the rights both not to have children and to have children. In the 5th chapter, I talk about violence of a different sort, most specifically rape here. And this chapter deals with narratives from Philippine diaspora, from South Korea, from Japan, and from the Indian diaspora. And all these narratives, although from very different parts of the world, very different societies, they all engage with the pursuit of justice for women from a range of class, educational, ethnic, religious, and national backgrounds who've been raped by acquaintances or strangers, or they've been murdered, or both. And these narratives highlight these women's voices, their humanity, and their dignity among broader cultures that condone and even encourage reproductive crime. And you'll see here, as elsewhere, I really emphasize how much these narratives bring to the fore women's humanity and their dignity. In the 6th chapter, the attention turns to family violence. I look at a series of texts that both perpetuate or describe perpetuating and interrupting cycles of family violence. And by family violence, we mean a real range of behaviors, including physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse that occurs within families. The narratives that I focus on in this chapter really call attention to the subjectivities of girls and women who are grappling with intergenerational family violence and/or intersectional family violence. We see characters both perpetuating this violence as well as deliberately interrupting cycles of abuse. And these are really painful stories. And although I've taught them, I tend to teach them later in the semester when students are a little more comfortable with one another, so they can feel a little more better equipped to have those difficult conversations. Then finally, I wrap up the book with Chapter 7. The focus, yeah?
Excuse me, your time is up. I hope that you can wrap up fast.
Yes, I'm on my penultimate slide. So, intimate partner violence, looking at texts from India, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand. And these narratives spotlight the importance of broad community commitment to creating a just environment. They point out just how readily women are held responsible for the abuse they experience, and they also reveal how little it would take to bring a stop to this abuse. And just finally, I just want to reiterate that the narratives that I analyze, as with so many stories of inequity and violence, are calls to action. They take us deep into fights for justice, highlighting dignity, agency, resilience, and resistance. Their words have the capacity to inspire and strengthen us, giving us courage, sometimes guidance on how we can actively recreate our worlds. So I will stop my share there, and my apologies, Abigail, for going over time.
No. Thank you so much, Professor, for that insightful introduction to your book. It's a real privilege to hear you walk us through the key themes and motivations behind your work. Our next section is for the discussants. We have 20 minutes for each discussant. We suggest that the discussants ask questions for 10 minutes and let the author respond for 10 minutes. So our first discussant is Professor Durba Mitra, the Richard B. Wolff Associate Professor in the Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. Professor Mitra's work brings together feminist theory, sexuality studies, and global intellectual history. Her first book, Indian Sex Life, offers a compelling exploration of how colonial constructions of deviant female sexuality shaped modern social thought, and was awarded the Bernard S. Combe Book Prize. She also curated the multimedia exhibit Solidarity, Transnational Feminisms, Then and Now, and her second book, The Future That Was, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. It traces the evolution of third world feminism and South-South intellectual networks. Professor Mitra, we look forward to your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Wang.
Wow, Professor Mitra, thank you so much for the incredibly generous comments on the book. I'm just left speechless. I really, really appreciate it. And Dr. Wang, could you remind me, I have just 10 minutes, is that right, to answer?
Yes, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, so it's 8:50, so I have my eye on the clock here because these are such important, crucial questions. And I'll give about 3 minutes to each so we can wrap up at 9 o'clock, or wrap up this portion of the prayer at 9 o'clock. So very quickly then, how did I choose these stories and texts, particularly because exactly as Professor Mitra noted, they are tremendously diverse, very different parts of Asia. They take on a whole range of topics surrounding gender justice. I wish there were a beautiful, clean answer to this. There isn't. As with all my books, I just read and read and read, and I looked, just kept reading. And what I was looking for, because as you know, in a book, one has to make really tough choices. I was looking for threads that tied different stories, different narratives together, and stories and texts that not only would resonate well with one another, but that were also accessible. And as I say in the introduction, right, this book was first envisioned actually by the Modern Languages Association Publications Program. My amazing editor there, James Hatch, wanted a book that would be accessible to the classroom, right? And so that comes with certain constrictions because, of course, to be able to teach a book, it has to be relatively accessible. It has to be in translation. So that in itself really narrowed the books on which I could focus. I also wanted to try to capture the different major types of gender inequity and gender-based violence. And of course, I realize in doing that, one makes really tough decisions there too. And I think there are many different books actually that I could have written that would have the same impact or effect or address the same topic. But I really was looking for a diverse set of texts that were accessible and that I thought did a powerful job of addressing precisely the issues and the questions that you brought up in your just really brilliant and generous comments. In terms of the analytic of Asia, it's interesting how this came about too. You know, as mentioned, I'm a cultural historian of East Asia. I started out as a scholar of Japan and then realized that, you know, the work I wanted to do with Japan, I really needed to know more about China, which got me much more deeply into China. And then I realized actually to do this work, I need to learn a lot more about Korea. And so ended up spending a number of years living in East Asia and doing field work in vernacular archives across East Asia. But of course, you do that and you realize, well, what about all these connections with South Asia and Southeast Asia? And, you know, I didn't unfortunately have the time to delve as deeply into those parts of Asia as I really would have liked to and I really wanted to. And as I have to say, a number of my students have. So it's really encouraging to me to see what the next generation is doing with this work on trans Asia. But a couple of things, you asked what did I learn thinking across this incredibly broad and diverse space that we call Asia. First of it, which is that we really need to do more in putting our own work into broader comparative context, conversation, and so forth. Each one of us can only learn a certain number of languages, can only read a certain number of books. But no matter what the focus of our research and teaching is, I think it's really important, exactly as you do, Professor Mitra, in your own work, just think about what I'm focusing on, how does that fit into broader conversations? How does that fit into broader dynamics and phenomena that are taking place close to home and then maybe not so close to home, and not always using Europe or the Americas, Euro-American societies as our point of comparison. And that was when I started in this field, one of the real challenges that comparative literature was facing. We'd focus on Japan, but it's also always Japan vis-a-vis the West, or even East Asia vis-a-vis the West, and not looking at other parts of the world. So working on this project really emphasized to me the importance, it really reconfirmed to me the importance of thinking more broadly, not only globally, but also across Asia. You asked about the place of translation. I think that's huge, and I'm so glad we have Professor Fulton as one of our respondents today, who, of course, he and his wife and translation partner, Juchan Fulton, have done remarkable work in bringing South Korean or Korean literature to English-speaking audiences. I think translation is of utmost importance here. We can't all know every language, and even with AI now and the accessibility of machine translations, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Translation, I think, hopefully Professor Fulton will talk about this in his remarks. Translation needs to be done thoughtfully, it needs to be done responsibly and well, and so forth. And we can't just rely on translations, but it's part of a broader conversation and a broader effort to think beyond our areas of comfort and our primary areas of knowledge. Finally, you asked about the dissemination of texts and rightly pointed out the impact on hearts and minds that literature, that stories can have in ways that other forms of knowledge and knowledge production cannot. And anyone reading my bibliography can see really quickly that I rely a lot on sources outside literature, outside film. I'm very dependent on exactly the types of reports and NGO documents and studies that you and so many others have done and brought to light. But just as you said, and as you really perceptively noted, there's something different about the stories. That being said, dissemination is tough, right? So we have in just the small sampling of texts that I analyze in gender justice, they're books that have been translated into dozens of languages that are super popular. I deliberately started the book, in fact, in the first chapter, 2 of the 3 works on which I focus are true international bestsellers, right? Cho Nam-ju's novel, Kim Ji-young, and Murata Sayako's novel, Convenience Store Woman. So these are novels that have traveled far and wide, of course, many languages still to be translated into. They're quite popular. They've made, I think, tremendous impacts in many societies, although in very, very different ways. And that's fascinating study in and of itself. But there are also a lot of stories that I look at that, even though they have been translated into English, they haven't been translated into any other language, or they've been translated into only a few languages, and they don't get much traction for various reasons. And there are all kinds of reasons we could spend quite a bit of time discussing. And my hope is that as we go forward, my hope is that one of the things that this book will bring to our attention is just the range of stories out there and the number of works that really could make a difference if they were translated, if they were brought to a larger number of the reading public. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't call attention to all those stories that we never hear, and all the stories that are never written, are never recorded for a whole range of reasons. And I'm very conscious as a scholar of literature that I'm reading, that I have access to, just those stories that have had a publisher, they've had an editor. In the case of this book, they've had a translator. I think social media is really changing the field of literature. It's changing the whole landscape. And I think if I were writing this book now, and certainly if I were writing it 5 years from now, the kind of texts that I would be using, or just the range to which I would have access, would be even more, because more and more people would have the ability to share their story. And our understandings of what constitutes literature would be even broader. So I see it's 9 o'clock, so I will stop there. So much more to say. Thank you so much. Wow, I'm still very moved. So thank you.
And I just want to say thank you. I also just want to say, just to reflect on what you just said, it's the other thing that I'll just say as an effect of this book is just realizing how many people who would have never written 50 years ago are now writing. So it's just it's really a moving thing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank both of you for this very interesting discussion. It's time for our next discussant. Our second discussant is Professor Bruce Fulton, the inaugural holder of the Yang Bin Ming Chair in Korean Literature and Literary Translation at the University of British Columbia. Professor Fulton teaches both pre-modern and modern Korean literature, as well as Korean to English translation. His courses emphasize close reading and a deep engagement with diverse voices of Korea's rich literary tradition. His research focuses on modern Korean fiction, especially the works of Hwang Sun-won, the lesser-known genres such as women's literature, military camptown lit fiction, and diasporic writing. As a teacher and a mentor, he is dedicated to guiding students toward both academic and personal growth in literary translation and scholarship. Professor Fulton, at this point, I'd hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, and thank you also to Paul D'Ambrosio and East China University for making this wonderful panel possible. I'd also like to thank Lauren McLaughlin, the editor-in-chief of the University of Washington Press, and especially the Women's and Gender series, which One Left became part of. I could tell you horror stories about how long it took us to get this, our translation published, but I'll perhaps save that for the Q&A. And last but not least, I would like to thank Chu-Chan Fulton, my life partner, co-translator, who has worked together to do what we do in terms of teaching and translating. So I too would like to start out by quoting the rhetorical question by Ms. Nguyen that Karen Thornber started her presentation with. Literature does not change the world until people get out of their chairs, go out into the world, and do something to transform the conditions of which literature speaks. So I'd like to focus in my remarks, how do we transform the conditions of which literature speaks? And I will offer 3 proposals, and then I would hope that Karen might find some time to address them. So how do we address the conditions? How do we take part in gender justice? Number 1, I would suggest we do it by humanizing the individual. How do we humanize the individual? We do this by returning the individuals who, in many cases, have been consigned to historical oblivion, we return them to historical memory. And I would like to give you an example by talking about One Left by Kim Soom. Professor Thornber's discussion mentions from the very start the name of the protagonist, Pungil, but until the very end of the story, the protagonist remains in the shadows, and it's not till the very end of the story that we learn her name. It's a brilliant ending to the story, and let me just summarize what happens. So, as Professor Thornber mentions, the protagonist has been fixated on the number of former Korean so-called comfort women who still survives. And when she learns that only one of the reported comfort women is still alive, but on her deathbed at a hospital, she decides to pay her a visit to emphasize to her that even after you are gone, there will be one left, meaning me, the protagonist. On her way to the hospital, she's taking public transportation, which again is kind of ironic considering her sheltered existence ever since she escaped from the comfort station in Manchuria in 1945. She has an epiphany, and the epiphany is a memory of an incident that takes place when she and the other girls, and I specifically use the term girls because these women in the story were girls when they were taken, some of them not even physically mature to do what they were asked to do. So she and some of the other girls are on their way to a town across a river to serve the Japanese officials and soldiers there. And on the way back, the boat hits rough water, and the narrator is thrown over the side. And as she's underwater, wondering what's become of her, her head breaks the surface, and she hears the calls of the other girls. And what the other girls are saying is, "Pungil, Pungil, Pungila!" And this, she realizes on the bus that is a name that she has not used and in 70 years and has practically forgotten. So what Kim Soom is doing by ending the novel in this way is to suggest that Pungil has recovered what in Korea we refer to as jangche, identity. She has recovered her identity as an individual, and by extension, she has recovered the identity of the other 200,000 plus girls who were taken from their ancestral homes in Korea, implying that each of these girls had an ancestral home, a family, a community, and they were taken away to historical oblivion. But what Kim Soom has done is begun the process of restoring these individuals, not this group, these individuals, to historical memory. How do we go about taking part in gender justice? Number two, I would suggest it is through teaching. Before I became a university professor, I was a freelance copy editor and, of course, with Juchan, a literary translator. I do not regard myself so much as a scholar as I do a teacher. And I learned very soon upon my arrival at the University of British Columbia that many of my students were international students. They paid 10 times the tuition of domestic students. They're under a lot of stress. And what I have found over the years is that by humanizing each one of the students in my courses, I do this by memorizing their names. It takes me 2 or 3 weeks. But by acknowledging them as separate individuals, I find that it is much easier for them to engage with the stories I assign. And as Professor Wang mentioned, I try to make sure that they're not only developing intellectually, but also humanly. And over the years, I found to my great pleasure that many of my Korean female students have entered professions such as social sciences, and perhaps most importantly, the practice of law. And in this way, I would like to think that I am helping some of my students to take part in achieving gender justice. Finally, how do we involve ourselves with gender justice? We translate works of literature. Ju-chan and I, we are independent translators. We are not quote unquote commissioned, i.e. offered a sum of money to translate this. We translate what engages us. And for over 40 years, we have found that what engages us most in modern Korean literature is writing by women. Our very first publication in the United States about 35 years ago, and perhaps the very first anthology of writing by Korean women, Words of Farewell, was published by Seal Press, a feminist press. And we will always remember, shortly after the book was published, we met at the University of California, Berkeley, Elaine Kim, a pioneering scholar of diaspora literature. And she told us, you just can't believe how much this anthology has done to empower my female Korean students. So we hope that through our translations, one of the authors, the lead author of that volume, we continue to translate. In fact, a collection of 4 of her stories will be coming out in July as a Penguin Modern Classic. We would like to think, and here I'm drawing on the Afghani activist Malala Yousafzai, who famously said, "One book can change the world." We would like to think that one translation can change the world. And we not only translate, but we do all we can to make sure the book is made accessible to our readers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Fulton, for that. And thank you to both you and Ju-chan for your I hadn't realized it was 40 years. Your 40 years of translating Korean literature, particularly Korean literature by women. So you brought up some really, really important points, and I want to thank you for that. I'll address each of them. I see I probably have until about 9:21, 9:22. Is that correct, Professor Wang? And
Yes.
okay. So I want to thank you, Professor Fulton, for bringing back to our attention the words of Viet Thanh Nguyen. Literature alone, reading literature alone, won't save or change anything. We have to get out of our chairs and change things, transform the conditions about which literature speaks. It's that real gap, isn't it, between knowledge and action with impact too. I agree with you completely. The importance of humanizing individuals, returning individuals to historical memory. This is exactly, just as you said, what literature does. I'm so glad you brought up the example of Kim Soom's One Left and just how powerfully Kim Soom does that. Not every writer does that quite so explicitly, but it is absolutely the case. And this is part of what went into choosing the writers who I did for this book. I really wanted to bring to the fore works that at their core not only exposed different forms of gender injustice, gender inequity, gender-based violence, and so forth, but that they exposed these forms, they engaged with these types, of injustice, of brutality, while at the same time humanizing, restoring dignity, agency to the individuals who they were discussing. Of course, different texts do this in different ways. There's not one single way to humanize an individual. And also a lot of this is a matter of interpretation. So I, as literary critic, or someone as a reader or a student encountering a book for the first time, might not agree that an individual is humanized or given dignity or given agency. You know, I've had discussions with my students, and I'll get to the teaching part in a minute because I think that's equally important. But I've had discussions with my students about what does it actually mean to humanize an individual, or to give them dignity, or to give them agency, or to bring, I shouldn't even say that, give them, to bring to the fore their dignity, their agency, their resistance, their resilience. That's part of the reason I tried to bring in such a diverse range of texts, because what speaks to one person, what one person analyzes or understands in a particular way, isn't necessarily going to be seen in the same or even a similar way by another individual, another student in the case of, you know, the classroom context, but another reader just in the case of translation. But I think at the core, our writers really are focused on bringing the individual story to our attention, giving the individual time and the opportunity to speak. And when I teach this material, so here I'm very into teaching again, and I will address teaching head on in a moment. Just say, you know, when I'm teaching or discussing this material, I really try to have our students, you know, or whomever I'm discussing the material with, really think carefully about who's doing the talking, right? Whose perspective are we seeing this from? Under what conditions are we learning what we're learning? You know, all these different dynamics, some very nuanced, some much more explicit. And thinking together about how a particular work or a particular group of works from a single society, from multiple societies, or a single period from multiple period, brings these different voices, perspectives, experiences to the fore. I'm so glad you brought up teaching. As Professor Mitra mentioned, I'm the faculty director of our Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning, the Richard L. Menschel faculty director. The Bach Center is responsible. We are the major teaching and learning center in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. That, of course, includes the Harvard College, Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. We're responsible for training all our graduate student teaching fellows. In fact, beginning the fall, and have required training. We're talking here about, you know, 500 new teachers every year at the graduate student level, and then we have all our undergraduate course assistants. Total about 800 new teachers every fall. We have our work cut out for us, but it's incredibly rewarding to work with new teachers, both graduate students, undergraduates, but also our faculty, whether we're talking our non-tenure track faculty, our lecturers, our preceptors, our tenure track faculty, or our tenured faculty, including our most senior faculty, some of whom are absolutely our most incredibly creative and innovative teachers. And what I've been struck by through, you know, I've been at the Bach Center now for almost a year, is this real commitment to teaching, to creating open conversations, to promoting civil discourse, civil dialogue, civil disagreement, constructive disagreement within our classrooms. And again, I see this everyone from, you know, the new teaching fellows who are just starting out, you know, in their early years of grad school, to some of our most senior tenured faculty who've been in the classroom for decades and still are eager to learn how to become even more effective teachers. It's been really inspiring. These are difficult times, as we all know, But our students deserve, and we are here to provide them with spaces where no matter who they are, no matter what their background, their religion, their ethnicity, their gender, no matter, their political standpoint, doesn't matter. Every student deserves to feel welcome. Every student deserves to be, to take your words from a moment ago, to be humanized, right? Seen as an individual with valid ideas, valid perspectives, and so forth. And exactly as you said, Professor Fulton, effective teaching involves, humanizing our students, right? Making sure that they feel seen and they feel heard, helping them develop personally, right? And it's really exciting to me. I've been, on the faculty at Harvard now for almost 20 years, and it's been really exciting to me to see how my students have grown both over the course of a semester, but even more exciting is watching what happens across time. And I've had the distinct pleasure of teaching a number of pre-medical students. So really seeing how their perceptions of medicine have changed through reading narratives like these, through understanding individuals as human beings, right? The patients they'll be seeing as human beings. And so just cannot emphasize the importance of teaching enough in this context. And of course, I've been teaching on gender and justice for some years now in our first year seminar program. So, our first years are freshmen at the college, as well as in the summer school to individuals from high school, students 15, 16 years old, all the way through folks who are very well established in their careers. And it's these stories have moved them and really helped them along in their own journeys. Finally, I realize I'm running out of time here to answer your questions, Professor Fulton, but I just want to say certainly translation as a means of transforming the conditions of which literature speaks. As you noted, had been commented on your own work, you're bringing to the fore writing by, and Ju Chan's bringing to the fore writing by women, writing by Korean women. It's made all the difference in how we understand, particularly outside of Korea, individuals who can't speak Korean, who can't read these texts in the original, how they understand the experiences of Korean women, Korean individuals more broadly, and in so doing, their own societies, because the differences are not nearly as great as we sometimes can and sometimes imagine. And yes, to one book can change the world for sure. I've seen it in my own students, one book changing how they think about things. That certainly has happened to me as well. And finally, the point about access, I couldn't agree more. And, we're, I think, trying to do, or we should try to do all that we can to make more of these materials available to a broader number of readers. So you don't have to be associated with an institution of higher education to have access. You don't have to be wealthy to have access to these really important texts. So I see it's 9:22. I'm unfortunately out of time, Professor Fulton, but thank you so much for those really thoughtful comments. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Thornber, for keeping us on schedule. Now it's finally for our final discussant. Our final discussant is Professor Faye Xiao, a professor of Chinese studies at the University of Kansas. Her research delves into gender, youth culture, and literary representations in contemporary China. Her recent publications include Youth Economy, Crisis, and Reinvention in 21st Century China, and the co-edited volume Feminisms with Chinese Characteristics. She's currently working on the new book, The Hen Heckles in the Morning, which explores the gendered soundscapes and the dynamics of female leadership in modern Chinese literature and culture. Professor Xiao, we are excited to hear your perspectives. Please take it away.
Thank you, Abigail, for your very nice introduction. And also thanks to Paul and Karen for inviting me to this wonderful event that gives me this opportunity to reread Karen's wonderful book and share some comments and questions on this volume. So this book, did like a wonderful job bringing together a large set of representative uh, narratives composed by a very diverse body of Asian and also Asian diaspora writers, on issues related to gender injustice and also gender-based violence, this often neglected, hidden, secret pandemic that is going on across Asia and also beyond. So, and I think we have already heard about many great things, great contributions this book has made to multiple disciplines and many ideas, discussed by my fellow discussants, panelists, deeply resonated with me. Um, and I have a lot to say, and I have 6 pages of notes. And so I suppose we could go on and on, talking about all the great things that this book has done to multiple disciplines. But I think for the sake of time, probably I'll just focus on 2 main things that I take away, from reading this wonderful book. So related basically to my double identity as a teacher and also a scholar in modern Chinese literature and also gender studies. So as a teacher and also as a scholar, I find this book particularly significant and also useful, as both a pedagogical tool and also as a critical theoretical intervention. So I'll talk about the first point, was planning to use it, in the classroom, but then I took on my sabbatical, so I didn't get a chance to go back to the classroom to use it. But I remember in an earlier conversation, and we talked about this question, how to teach gender and gender justice productively. So for me, the question is translated as how to find ways to make those seemingly abstract ideas, gender is abstract and highly theoretical and even controversial idea, and also justice equally abstract. So how to make all those abstract ideas, more relevant and concrete and relatable for our students from very diverse backgrounds. And I think Karen's new book provides a perfect answer to this question. So I will quote from her introduction. Quote, narratives help readers put their own experience and the traumas into broader perspective. Teaching stories on gender inequity and gender-based violence has impressed on me their broad, effective, and emotional readers. Unquote. So in other words, the writing and also reading of this book engage with writers and also readers' hearts and minds. So to echo Durba's words earlier, and I think that is very important because as Abigail has just mentioned, currently I'm doing, my own research on sound and particularly, gendered voices, gendered sound making practices. So basically sound, I propose that sound is an effective media. Um, so to work against or to challenge this body-mind, binary structure. Because if we can quote Schaeffer, this Canadian musician composer, hearing or sound is like touching at a distance. So that means, like sound is effective media to engage with our bodies and the minds at the same time. And in that sense, we can also say, the narratives included in this book can serve as something like, effective media, effective text, because, they help build up this intersubjective, so between individual subjects and also cross-cultural empathy network that transmits stories, ideas, and feelings, affects, and also bodily experiences. And I think that is very important because a lot of the, like different forms of gender-based violence actually, brings damages and harms, women's bodies. So bodily experience is a central part there, and also transmit this dynamic energies, from the writers and also translators of the narratives to the author of this book, that is Karen, of course, and also to other scholars, such as, like today's discussants, and also other readers, including our students who use this book as their key text in the classroom. And I think in today's world, in today's age marked by divisions and conflicts and the crisis, such an effective network of cross-cultural empathy and solidarity is particularly welcome and appreciated by our students. So, and also by teachers. To echo, Karen's earlier words, so we don't feel alone by writing and reading and also studying the this book. And then I will talk a little bit also about, the scholarly contribution of this book. And this book, stands out as this pioneering and groundbreaking work in remedying this Eurocentric tendency in both comparative literature and also gender studies, and as well as the East Asia dominant trend in Asian studies. So that is why I feel particularly excited to join this conversation, to talk with scholars, who work in other disciplines and on other areas. And so this book's methodological innovation and theoretical significance are testified by its deep engagement with a diverse body of scholars, including today's panel, today's discussants. And the key approach in this book opens new possibilities when we engage in research on global Asia. So we all know that is like the latest trend in Asian studies. So basically, this recent development aims to liberate Asian studies from, this straitjacket of area studies and relocate it in this transnational and also global context. And more specifically, in studying Asian feminisms in its plural form. And it's particularly important to map out the threads in a global context, with this emphasis on the continuous and still ongoing interactions of feminist theories and practices within the region and also between the region and the rest of the world. And also the third world feminism, as Durba has just mentioned. So all those things are very important. And I think Karen's new book is a pioneering study in setting this new theoretical paradigm in the field of both Asian studies and also gender studies. And again, this approach is particularly timely and also significant given the current ideological and also geopolitical circumstances. So this book inspires us to think long and hard about how to figure out new ways of rebuilding both intra-regional and also inter-regional solidarity across national, racial, and ideological boundaries. And sometimes, as scholars and also, our students, we feel kind of hopeless, in such a age marked by divisions, conflicts, and a crisis. But I think this book offers us new possibilities of rebuilding a discourse of hope. So all those are very inspiring to me. So I'm also, thinking along all those lines to develop some new projects. And then for questions, I have two questions kind of related to my comments. So the first one is about teaching. Since I do want to use it when I go back to the classroom, I do want to use this book as a key text when I teach about modern China and also gendered modernity in East Asia. And so, Karen, I suppose you have already used this book in your class. So what's your experience like? So do you have any like tips or advice that you'd like to share, like how to use this book like more effectively, how to teach gender and gender justice more effectively in the classroom, and particularly, under today's ideological and political circumstances, so how to approach some of the like controversial issues, and as you analyzed in this book. And also some passages, they do contain some quite like graphic depictions of gender-based violence, so how to deal with all those kind of like a thorny and sometimes can be painful and traumatizing topics for our young students. And then the second question. So I would say, that this volume is already very, very rich and it's a big book, very thick book, and providing this very comprehensive account of gender injustice and gender-based violence through the mediation of, Asian literatures in multiple languages. But I wonder what else you would add to it if more space was allowed by the publisher. Or are there any new texts that you wish you could add if, say, like a volume 2 of this book would be published? Um, and more specifically, how about, narratives about violence against queer groups in Asia and also its diaspora communities? Because, I mean, including those narratives might change our, stereotypical view of women being the only victims of gender-based violence. Yeah, so I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Xiao, for wonderfully thoughtful and very, very generous remarks. I so appreciate that. And I appreciate you joining us on your sabbatical as well. That's incredibly generous of you. So I see it's 9:36. I'll speak till 9:45, so we have 15 minutes then for audience questions. So to answer these two questions, first about teaching, and then what would I put in had I had more space? Both, again, all the questions asked of me this evening, I could spend hours on each of them. So I'll just be very, very brief. Teaching one's own book is a challenge, as I think many on this call probably have experienced. Becomes even more of a challenge, of course, when you're addressing such controversial material. So I'll just describe a few, not even so much strategies, as just guiding principles when I teach this book, and also when I assign passages from other works of scholarship that I've written. First off, I make it really clear to my students that my way of reading these texts is one way of reading these texts, but it's not the only way. I think this is really important for our students to know when we're teaching our own work, but it's also important for students to know no matter whose work we're teaching, particularly if it's someone super famous or with a really big name in the field. I never want my students to think that, well, because the professor said such and such, or some famous critic said such and such, that they too must believe that, or that is the only way of reading a particular narrative. I think especially in the case of literature, this is true across fields, but especially maybe in the case of literature, which can and should be read and interpreted in multiple ways, it's important for students to feel like they can bring something to the conversation too, and something really, really valuable to the conversation. And this is regardless of whether the issue is controversial or not. This is just across the board. And we want to create these spaces where students can disagree with us or with anyone who's writing. Of course, we set up standards and norms, class norms in advance of what, constitutes civil disagreement and how to disagree with one another productively and in a constructive way. Things are a little more complicated, just as you noted, when we're teaching controversial topics, controversial issues, or issues issues that are really, really painful, right? In terms of controversial issues, here too, what I try to do is present multiple sides to every story, multiple perspectives on experiences, and really make clear when an issue is controversial within its own society or in a broader national, regional, global setting, and so on and so forth. So here again, the student is coming from a different ethnic background or religious background or political perspective, that they feel and they know that their perspective is valid, right? That they're not going to be criticized by me as the instructor or by their classmates simply for coming at the question from a different perspective. So it's about creating those spaces where students can bring their whole selves to the classroom. That's much easier said than done, of course, in today's environment. It requires a lot of trust on everyone's part. You really try to create that right from the beginning of the semester, of your interactions, or of your the first classes. You brought our attention, rightly so, to the fact that a lot of these texts have really graphic depictions of violence in them. And what I try to do, or what I do, is say a novel like Kim Sim's One Left. We read that very late in the semester. So the students already have grown accustomed to reading narratives that have graphic depictions of violence in them. They've also gotten more comfortable with one another, right? And they've gotten more comfortable with me as the faculty member too. And I always tell them, if for whatever reason a particular text, a particular topic just hits too close to home, that they can just tell me that they're uncomfortable reading a particular text, and I'll find something else for them to read. I think just leaving students with that option makes them feel a little, I don't know, it seems to remove constraints. It makes them feel a little more comfortable. And so students actually don't take me up on that very much at all, but the option is 100% there. And, I've rewritten exam questions and so forth, just so students can, feel as though their own experiences are being acknowledged, particularly if they've experienced the same kind of trauma that's being described in one of our texts. Sometimes students really embrace that. They are so glad to see a reflection of their own experience, legitimized, humanized in that way. But sometimes the reaction is the opposite, and that's totally fine. Just very briefly, I can see already I'm running out of time here. Your second point about what would I have added had more space been allowed? You're absolutely right about the experiences of queer individuals, the LGBTQIA plus community. This is something that I talked about with my editor, and we agreed that for this book, there just wasn't enough space in terms of the experience of sexual gender minorities is even worse than that in general. Again, we're speaking very generally, is even worse than that of the individuals who I describe, and that it wouldn't do justice to those experiences if I just kind of tacked an example here, had another example there. I wasn't so comfortable with doing that, again, because I was really worried about doing justice to the experience. And what we both thought of, my editor and I thought of, really deserves a book of its own. And it's a book I absolutely hope to write, plan to write one day. I think, in addition to the narratives and experiences of sexual and gender minorities, doing more with Asian diasporas, doing more to bridge Asian and Asian diaspora literatures. I think, Asian studies is one part of the university and Asian studies is another. But when you look at the actual dynamics of what actually happens, people on the ground, the boundaries become much blurrier. And I really would have welcomed the opportunity to dive into that a little more deeply, particularly in the wake of COVID-19, and look at how the pandemic impacted immigrant communities, not only in North America, that's where being based in North America, that's where my students and my frame of reference often tends to be, but in diaspora communities across Asia. So I think there's a lot of rich material coming out of these communities now. It's just the timing didn't work quite with my book. I will say this is the shortest of all my books. I tend to write very long, 600-700 page books, and this one is 250 pages. And I really felt that constraint. I felt there's so many more. And I started out with so many more examples, but one has to make tough choices. And that's what I did. But thank you so much, Professor Xiao. Great comments, really important points. And thank you for those thoughtful questions as well.
Thank you, Professor Thornber, for this illuminating response, and many thanks as well to our discussants for their thoughtful and engaging reflections. As the chair of this discussion, I hope I can take the privilege of asking the first question. One of the things I really appreciate about your book is how it brings together literary works across Asia to engage with gender justice from a transnational perspective. You note that much of the existing scholarship on gender tends to be nation or region specific, which makes your cross-cultural approach particularly refreshing. But that said, I wondered how you navigated the question of cultural specificity in your thematic organization. While reading stories across national borders is clearly crucial for understanding broader patterns, do you find that cultural or historical differences sometimes complicate or even challenge the thematic connections you draw across this diverse contexts?
Thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Wang. You're absolutely correct. It's always, or I shouldn't say always, it's ordinarily a very tricky balance, isn't it, between the cultural specificity that we have to have and the broader comparative perspective that brings so much to our research. I tried in this book, as in all of my scholarship, or at least the scholarship that does go across borders in this way, to strike a balance, right? And so for each of the texts that served as the primary text for the analysis, those 28 or so narratives, I did a deep dive into the specific cultural context, the specific history, and so forth. And so, you'll find that in the book, throughout the book, again, as much as I could, because there are constraints, of course, on space. There are also constraints on the information that's available. And, say when I was, diving deep into a Cambodian short story on sex work in a particular time, in a particular place, among a particular social class, and so forth, the number of secondary sources becomes fewer and fewer, right? So I feel for certain of the narratives I looked at, I was able to access a broad range of secondary sources that could really help me with that specific cultural context. And so I felt pretty secure that I was doing justice to that, again, as much as one can with the limited space. And there were other times where I got a little frustrated with myself, with scholarship more broadly, that there just hadn't been as much written as I wanted to have, so I could feel a little more secure. What did help here, again, I will return back to my students, particularly the graduate and undergraduate students who I hired as research assistants to help me with this book, and just running material by them, right? And asking them really explicitly, like, does this make sense from what you know of the specific cultural, historical, linguistic, and so on and so forth dynamic? And I credit them everywhere in the book where their readings were different from my own, and where they brought to the fore really important insights that I had missed. And what this highlights for us, I think, is that, well, among many things, is the importance of collaborative work, right? So we all have as much as we try, some of us, to be very broad and have broad knowledge in addition to very deep, specific knowledge, none of us can know everything. Generative AI is looking promising, but it's not where we need it to be yet. And collaborative work, I think, is the answer to a lot of this. Just talking with people in a very informal way. It can be everything from informal conversations to, co-writing or co-authoring a piece together. So just want to thank you for that thoughtful question. I do want to use that question as an opportunity just to remind all of us, myself included, that as fun and rewarding as it is to do this transnational work, and as important as the transnational work is, transnational work quickly loses its power and it loses its legitimacy, or risks losing its legitimacy, if it doesn't have that solid foundation of cultural specificity, of historical context, and so forth. So I want to thank you for that. It was a really important point.
Thank you for that thoughtful and nuanced response. It's given me a lot to think about. We now have some time for open discussion, well, specifically 10 minutes. I'd like to invite questions or comments from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute. Well, oh, okay. If you are joining us online, is there anyone? You can also post your questions in the chat in case. Okay, Alice Tian.
Hi, I just posted it in the chat, but a follow-up question to what Abigail just asked. Aside from like researching texts and having like hiring people for researching, have you also like ever thought of consulting with the people that have either like interacted with or like are from the cultural history that you're interested in writing about?
Oh, for sure. Thank you, Alice, for that important question. Yes, I absolutely do. And I benefit a lot from talking with individuals one-on-one, but also from traveling, giving talks, talking with groups of individuals, particularly, well, I shouldn't say particularly, but including academic and also non-academic settings. Of course, travel was made a little more difficult during COVID, so a lot of the workshops, conversations I had were over Zoom. But absolutely, personal conversations are a big part of what I do, not as much as, if I were an anthropologist and so forth. But it's important. And I think, one thing I didn't do so much of in this particular book that I absolutely am and will for future projects is working with social media. And of course, with social media, as with anything, one has to be careful. But I think there's just so much more in the field of gender justice that's coming out on social media, also in my other work in the medical and health humanities, that it's a great place, again, depending on the form and so forth, but there's great potential there for forging different kinds of connections that we might not have been able to in the past. So thanks so much for that.
Okay, now we have two more questions. The first one is from Silas Westner.
I can't hear you.
I think you are either on mute or that your microphone doesn't work because we cannot hear you.
You could type it in the chat.
Yes, you can probably type in the chat. And for the time being, who's the next? Who was the next one who raised his or her hand? Okay, so Ling, maybe it's time for you to raise your question.
So I see us if you cannot ask questions, so I wanted to say the second question. So thank you so much, Professor Thornber and everyone, for this profound talk. I had the privilege of teaching with Professor Thornber as a teaching fellow at Harvard of the Global Gender Justice course. So we really had students from all over the world and took that course in such a transformative experience. So you were such a role model in the classroom in making all the students feeling very included and heard, right? And also creating this safe space for everyone to discuss the difficult questions. But my question for you is, how do we draw more male students, broadly defined, right? And how to make them feel more interested in the course in the first place? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Ling Ling, or Dr. Ma, my former student, Ling Ling Ma, who as Ling Ling noted, Dr. Ma noted she served as a teaching fellow, teaching assistant for me when I taught this course, the gender justice course in Harvard Summer School, I think it was during COVID too, some years ago, where we really did have students we had high schoolers from the rural South in the United States, to individuals practicing, I think that was the course, we had an individual who was practicing law in Singapore, and sort of everyone in between. It was a wonderful group of students. I think one of the challenges I've faced with this course is exactly as Dr. Ma noted, that it tends to be far more women or individuals, who identify as women, cisgender women, transgender women, as than men. And I have not, students have shared with me various reasons why this might be the case. But I think, one of the hard challenges here, and more than one male student has shared this with me as well. When they'll come and say, wow, it looks like a great course, I'll say, well, why don't you take it? Oh no, I don't want to be in a place where men are just being bashed all the time. And I say, no, that's not actually what the course is about, right? But I think it's hard just reading a description of a course like this to really understand that. I mean, particularly for a student, someone just, out of high school or in early years of college. What I'm going to try to do in the future is include more narratives written by men, whether they're talking about their own experiences with gender justice or their experiences of our gender injustice, as the case is, or experiences of their loved ones. And I think that's where I haven't been as I really haven't done the work that I should have in bringing diverse voices into the course. So I brought diverse voices in a range of other ways, religion, political preference, ethnic background, nationality, and so forth. But I haven't in that particular way, and that's something I'm working on for future versions of the course, to bring in a broader range of narratives and also to advertise the course in, I think ways where individuals of all genders will feel as welcome as they absolutely are in the course itself. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you, Professor. And I will, we have a question from Western. He managed to type it in the chat. I'm going to read it. This work reminds him so much of Sui Sinfar's work, which he greatly admire. His question is that, did you ever have trouble uncovering or further your research in some of these stories, particularly in the context of silencing and reinforcement of norms against going against or grain the grain or your family? If so, what did you do to rectify such troubles? Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. And then there's another question. Okay. So, did I have trouble on, oh yes, did I ever? Right. So these, I mean, thank you, Silas. This is a really important question. And I'm so glad you brought this to our attention, because I've made it sound, I think, unwittingly as though, wow, there are all these sources and I'm doing all this reading and putting things together. And yes, there was a lot of that. However, for all the sources that are available and accessible and printed in the first place, there are far more, right, that are silenced. There are far more that are, if not impossible to collect, that become very, very difficult. And then there are the texts where, you know, they've received a lot of negative publicity. And, well, do you really want to work on this? This one's so controversial. If you include this, what are, you know, who's going to think what, and so on and so forth. And I tried to take a really balanced approach. And I include in this book some texts that are extremely controversial, in particular in their home country, in their home language, home environment, because I thought they were important. I thought they were important for readers to know about as texts, but even more than that, I thought the dynamics that they were bringing to the fore were really important. So important as texts themselves, as objects, but also the dynamics that they were bringing to the fore. You mentioned my family here. My family was nothing but supportive. I'm extraordinarily fortunate to have a very, very supportive family. I'm the daughter of two PhDs in physics, so my mother was only the second PhD in physics, female PhD in physics from California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. So I was really lucky to grow up in an environment where my own academic success was expected. And I've you know, had certainly gender-based struggles across my career, but not from my family. And I'm really lucky in that, and hope that, you know, or wish that more individuals had that advantage. But I certainly try to instill that in my students, right? And take that strength that I was given from my family and share it with my students. So I want to thank you for that question. Then we have
Still
another
have
group. Yes.
one more question. Yes.
Okay, one more question. I know we're out of time here. Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
And
maybe you can answer in a few minutes. And this is
yes.
a very, yeah,
Yes.
go away.
This is our final question. What do you think an average person can take away from your text to be more involved and interested in the topic? Spread the knowledge with those who are typically closed-minded. Okay, so this is a really fundamental, important question as well that I will answer in about 1 minute, but it deserves, as I think we all can recognize, a much longer answer. So I think first thing is just encouraging folks to read, to watch films, to explore artwork, just to learn about different perspectives. This is what we try to do in the classroom. Just learn about different perspectives, create spaces, and we all can do this, whether we're teaching a class, whether we're president of a club or a member of a club, a group of friends in a dorm, or so on and so forth. Just create a space where people can talk freely, where they can bring themselves to the table, where different perspectives are welcome, where we learn from one another, where we challenge the issue and not the person, right? So the focus is the issue, not the person, where we acknowledge and we respect everyone's humanity, where we have true civil discourse. I think that can help us go a long way. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for moderating this panel. And thank you to my friends and colleagues, Professor Xiao, Fulton, and Mitra. It's just such a delight to spend some time with you all this evening, and for those in Asia this morning.
Okay, that brings us to the